Hi everyone, this video is going to be looking at the Emigree by Rumens. Normally these videos are simply a rehash of the team sessions that we did before the summer. However, with this one, the poet herself has released some commentary on this poem over the summer, which has rather reframed our interpretation and approach to the poem. So this really is a video for the whole of year 11. For everyone who hasn't had this taught. So even those of you who did the team sessions before the summer, this video will be of use to you because it is also looking at a new way of reading this poem, which I think it's really important that you have to hand. So the key issue with this poem is the ambiguity of its subject matter. And I'm going to give you some nice phrases and stuff to build you up. So at first glance, it appears that this poem is about the experience of someone who had to leave their homeland as a child and feels alienated from both their original and new home. Okay, so that's kind of what we've talked about before, fairly straightforward. However, Rumens has discussed the term of the inner emigree in relation to this poem. The idea of someone who is sort of a stranger almost to themselves, and envisages the scenario where the country in the poem is that of youthful imagination, which we are gradually exiled from as we get older, and the voice in the poem is trying to recapture the joy of that youthful imagination which so many of us lose in adulthood. So therefore, this can be read as both a political poem commenting on the issue of belonging, or as a poem about the universal alienation of growing up and losing the joyful state of childhood, which we can never fully return to. So this poem, what we've talked about and discussed before with this poem isn't wrong. What we're doing is we're adding a new interpretation to it. And obviously then when we're getting into layers of meaning and interpretation, it's actually quite a helpful poem to enable us to gear up through the mark scheme if we can articulate it well. Okay. So I'm going to have to look at some different contexts as well, depending on how we read it. So thinking of the political reading, firstly, if we read this as someone who is exiled from their homeland, this is not based on Rumens' own experiences. She's from London. She's always lived there. She's drawn on some knowledge of emigration and living in London. She has worked with refugees and political exiles and things like that. So that clearly informed and influenced what she was writing about. There's also a deliberately non-specific feel to this poem. So these cities and countries could really apply to any refugee from any political or military conflict in the last 30 years. And there's lots of places to choose from. So again, thinking about this idea of alienation and feeling lost is becoming a much more common experience than perhaps a lot of us appreciate. And I think what's particularly interesting is the sense of ambivalence that's drawn. So if we are reading this as a political poem about the result of conflict on the people who are exiled, there is this sense of ambivalence for the refugees. They don't show this overwhelming gratitude to the new country because it's clear the voice in the poem feels unwelcome and is sad to have had to leave their birthplace. So rather than being, oh, thank God we're saved, there is this sadness and this longing for the place where they themselves were happy. It may be sick with tyrants, but the personal experience of the voice in the poem was a happy experience. And it's very clear that the voice left when they were a child, which is characterised by the positive memories associated with their birthplace. And this sense of being shielded from the conflict and being forced into exile rather than being something they chose, it's something they had to undergo. And so there's a tension between the positive memories and the harsher knowledge acquired later. And that also applies if we're reading this as the inner emigree, that sense of we have no choice about growing up, and society tends to force us to leave behind those childish things. And there's that longing to be able to return to that simpler, joyous time, which so much of society stops us from doing. So even though we become grown-ups and we have freedom and we can do all of this stuff, actually, there's also a level of resentment that we can't go back to the childish innocence that we once had. The comment in here about language is worth considering. It may by now be a lie banned by the state. So this is a thing that actually happens around the world, where many oppressive regimes sort of ban the language of an oppressed people. So this therefore attacks the education system, results in the control of public communications, and it's designed to eradicate histories and communications that rulers feel is out of their control. And it often is aimed at the younger generations, so they get them while they're young, and if you can create that generational rift between children and parents and grandparents who can't communicate effectively because the younger generations have learned a different language and have been sort of forced into a different culture, it can be very effective as a long-term mechanism of control. So we see this in Japan, banned the use of Korean in schools and workplaces. The USSR forced all the countries to sort of convert to Russian and the Cyrillic alphabet. Franco in Spain, General Franco banned all languages except Spanish under his rule until 1979. So I say that the USSR, this is not old ideas, this is stuff that's still relatively modern. Okay, and Franco almost totally eliminated some languages, particularly the Catalan language. The use of Kurdish in Turkey was banned until 1991. And it's something that Britain itself has done. So we tended to use more of a carrot than a stick approach. So when building empire, a lot of the British troops and people in charge there would discourage the use of native languages, encouraging the conquered lands to assimilate to English as basically an incentive, because if they can't talk to you, they can't trade with you, they can't help. So the ones who did learn English got an advantage. So there's more of a sort of incentive-based system. But again, it was about control, because then they could control who was in favour and who was able to flourish. So thinking about this now in this inner Emigree reading, I'm going to use a few notes and quotations from the article that Rumens has published. And if you talk to your English teachers, they will give you the full article. It's only one page of A4, but it does rather turn the reading of this poem on its head a little. So this is her opinion of her poem, and we have to respect that to a certain extent because she's the one who wrote it. So the Emigree is a metaphorical poem. The speaker isn't literally an emigrant. Emigration is a metaphor. The country referred to is really the country of imagination. It's one we all carry in our heads. It consists of memories, dreams, unfulfilled ambitions, youthful hopes, perhaps a romantic relationship which came to nothing. It's located in the past. This is one reason why the speaker can't return to it. But it's the source of inspiration for creative writing. The poem is a defense of the imagination in an everyday reality which doesn't recognise its importance. Okay, and that comes from the English Department newsletter from September of this year. So I think this is really key. There is nothing wrong with saying, to me, this poem seems to be about this, but you have to be aware of what the poet has said and the different readings there are. And I think particularly it may be that for us who have been, in the last 5-10 years, seeing this migration crisis and this refugee crisis that's been breaking out across the world, particularly places like Syria, then of course that's going to be our first instinct when reading this poem. But we have to be aware of what Rumens' sort of initial purpose was when she has put that out there into the world. And she therefore is focusing on this more universal experience that we all encounter, and this sense of the separation and the impossibility of returning, like when she talks about, I have no passport, there's no way back at all. And that sense of, because time is immutable, it's a more permanent separation than possibly any other sense of leaving one place for another. If you leave a country, theoretically it's still there, you could still go back in some way at some point. But here, it is such an impossibility. There is no way of travelling and no way of getting back to that. And it's that resentment and that frustration and that sense of almost being exiled from yourself, that sense of being an inner emigree, and I would always put that in inverted commas, is a really key idea in that more nuanced reading of the poem. Okay, so we're going to go through this like the other ones, but there will be extra notes added because my annotations were done before Rumens published this article, so I've added extra notes on each of the slides to help with the dual interpretation here. So blue notes are going to be looking at internal conflict and identity. Purple notes are looking at effects of conflict, and we'll talk about the sorts of conflict towards the end, and Pink's looking more at loss and absence in that sense of there being a gap that needs filling. So when we're looking at key terms, guilt is quite an interesting one in this poem. There is a sense of feeling guilty about the feelings that the voice has, and that almost the voice knows they shouldn't feel like this, but they do. There's that sense of being conflicted, having that sort of inner conflict which causes them problems, and that sense of being ambivalent, so not being sure how they feel about the situation they're in, not sure whether they can be happy or frustrated or sad about what they've had to leave behind. There's a sense of hostility in this poem, particularly from the external influences, particularly in the last stanza. There's a sense of regret, of loss, and the sense of this almost being a bit of a burden, having this memory of a place you can't return to, which sort of drags you down a little bit. So we've got light imagery is heavily used in this poem, and I've actually highlighted that on my copy that we'll go through, because as you'll see, the idea of sunlight and light is really important in this poem, and the connotations of that. And then that often leads to a lot of use of contrast or juxtaposition, where you've got these different ideas very close together, and the metaphorical imagery. And as Rumens has told us, the entire poem is arguably a metaphor for the sensation of being an adult who has lost their childhood joy and imagination. And so we could argue that the whole poem is an extended metaphor for that concept. Okay. So firstly, Emigree is a French term which is associated with leaving homeland due to a social or political pressure. Okay, so the equivalent in English would be a refugee. Okay, in English we normally talk about emigration as a choice. You choose to emigrate to Spain or something. Whereas in French it has that more political overtone, and it is key that this is the French term she's using, the Emigree. There was once a country, so that's got almost that once upon a timeness about it, which gives us that little clue to the childish innocence of this. But also that sense of it's been lost. There was once a country, and sense of being lost from where you belong. I left it as a child. So if you leave somewhere as a child, you don't make that choice. Someone makes that choice for you. So there's that sense of being powerless, that sense of not having a choice or an influence on this. This was a decision that was made for the voice of this poem. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. I love that. That's such a positive image, that idea, that sunlight clear. So there's this sense of regret with that but coming in. I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. You know, she's got this really vivid image, like as if sunlight's beaming down on it. And it's got therefore that sense, that implicit sense of loss of her remembered place. For it seems I never saw it in that November, which I'm told comes to the mild of this city. So there's this awareness that memories are selective. So if we're reading this in that political way of someone who had to leave a country as a child, this idea that almost that they're heavily filtered. So, you know, we're the sum of our memories and experiences, but memories can be very distorted. And the child's memory is likely to be very heavily filtered. They'll have been protected from the worst of it. So by never having seen the downside, there's this sense of all they have are these positive memories, and therefore this difficulty in appreciating the loss, the reason for leaving. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view. So you've got that quite ambiguous idea there, that there's almost these terrible things coming out that we hear, but it can't break her original view. So we've got this conflict between knowledge and memory, this sort of inner conflict, and therefore the conflict between intellect and emotion. So she might know these terrible newses, but her original view is a bright filled paperweight, like a little frozen positive moment in time, where it's this frozen image that is glorious to her, and therefore she can't, all the subsequent knowledge she gains isn't good enough to override that initial impression. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. So this idea of we're getting this conflict imagery coming in, and we'll see that more with tanks and things in the next stanza. So she's saying it might be at war, it might be sick with tyrants. So there's this sense of the city being alive, but also sick. But you would hope that you can recover from a sickness. So this argument of perhaps a passing problem, that there's hope in there. There's this desperation to believe in a future that where the tyrants have gone. And then my favourite line in the poem, but I'm branded by an impression of sunlight. So being branded is a very painful, damaging image. So branding is where you take basically like a stamp, a massive stamp, iron stamp, heat it up as hot as you can, and then you burn it into the skin. So people, in my mind, skips to cattle. So this is how people used to show their ownership of their cows, is they would brand like their insignia on the cattle. Also used in slavery and things like that. So there's this sense of ownership in a branding. So she feels like this memory of hers almost owns her or possesses her, and that she doesn't have much control over that. And she's branded by an impression of sunlight. So you would normally think an impression of sunlight is positive, but here it's connected to that sense of being branded, which is a painful, damaging image. So almost like it hurts her to have these images of a place that she can no longer go back to. And then if we consider this as the childish innocence that she has lost as an adult, the frustration of remembering the joy and the freedom of that childhood imagination and not being able to ever recapture it would be a very painful idea, particularly if you're someone who is campaigning for sort of creative freedom and things like that, where you know you're being distorted in the reality of what is achievable, but equally the frustration of not being able to recapture that freedom. So we have this real idealised imagery in this stanza, which suggests a childish, imaginative place where, you know, we've got the distorted reality of it only being sunlight clear, like summer holidays when you were small. You know, you go, oh yeah, summers were better then. And that's because you only remember the really good bits where you had those lovely days and you went out and did all those things, and all of the boring days with the rain all meld into one and you forget them. And you've also got this sense of the reality versus the fantasy in her experiences. So the sense of the frustration of reality crashing in on the fantasy, which she clearly prefers and has this sort of hold on her that she can't really shake. Okay. So moving on to the second stanza, we get the white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer. So real positive imagery. She's almost wistful for these memories of this place, real or imagined. But it has got almost that Disney-like sense of somewhere that doesn't really feel real. And it glows even clearer as time rolls its tanks and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. So again, we've got that very violent military metaphor there of time rolling its tanks between them. So this sense of destructive conflict and this adult world breaking in on this idealised, beautiful memory of hers. And again, so if we read this in the political sense, it's got that sense of the conflict that has destroyed this place of her childhood memories. And if we read it in the inner Emigree way, that sense that time is the enemy here, time is in control of the forces that are creating this ever widening separation, and it's using all these very destructive images like tanks to convey that sense of the rupture time is creating between the adult writing the poem and her memories of her childhood fantasies. So there's also got that sense of change going on, and that change is inevitable and something you can't control. And this idea of frontiers rise between us. So your frontiers like your borders. And this idea of feeling this separation growing, even though the two of them, her and this place of her memory, her imagination, want to be connected, outside forces are creating a frontier, a barrier between them. You know, as an adult, you can't spend all of your time playing in the woods because you have to pay the mortgage and do the shopping and sort the clothes out and things. And that sense of, if you've had to leave somewhere because of a war or a conflict, then it doesn't matter how much you wish you could go back to that place will have been inevitably changed or destroyed as a consequence of that which has happened. The child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. So this is a little complex, this bit, and Rumens' article here actually I found quite helpful. So a child's vocabulary, your language, your words are part of who you are. But if it's a child's vocabulary, then it's kind of unformed or unfinished. So again, if we're reading this in the political sense, that sense of she left as a child, so she only got so far in her language. So she was sort of unformed in who she was going to be and who that identity was going to be. And then as she's got older, it opens and spills a grammar. So this sense of spilling or losing something, but then perhaps also learning it, because you're moving from vocabulary to grammar, which is a more complex structure. And that sense of perhaps trying to recapture some of this as she has got older. But equally, there's this sense of the adult writer returning to the childhood fantasy. So she's got this child's vocabulary, the way she used to play as a child in this imaginative space. But now she can come with this more adult way of approaching this fantasy space, which is now developed into a grammar. So we could look at that as a metaphor for the way that she can now approach these idealized fantasy spaces. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. Which I think is lovely. Rumens describes that as the coloured molecules suggest a creation myth as invented by the child. And I think that's lovely, that sense of she'll be able to, as an adult, go back and find all the building blocks that she as a child used to create this space, this imaginary place, and now can understand it all better as an adult and see where all the inspiration came from. So that sense of re-engaging with something is really lovely. It may by now be a lie banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. So we've already talked about that from the political sense and the way that so often oppressive regimes try to suppress languages in order to allow their own control to come in. But now you've got this sense of I can't get it off my tongue. So even if it is banned by the state, you can't take it away from the person who already has it. They just can't use it. So it's suppressed rather than lost. But you've also got this idea of childish fantasies are almost discouraged in adulthood, almost as if they are banned by the state. So she's there going, I know it's a lie, I know this is silly, I know that this isn't how I'm supposed to be, but I can't get it off my tongue, I can't get it out of my head. It tastes of sunlight. So that is such a beautiful, positive image. And you see all the orange highlighting is all light imagery, remember. So that sense of it tastes of sunlight, this sense of really associated with positive ideas and a sense of what she's lost. And if you really dig down into it, obviously you can't taste sunlight. So we're already into metaphor on metaphor here. But if you think about what would your happiest, sunniest days be, and you'd probably be thinking of like ice cream on the beach or something like that, and having that would then suddenly remind you of what it was like to be 6 and having had the most glorious day ever, playing in the sea and things like that. So this sense of there's this almost physical tie to her that can just bring her back. It tastes of sunlight, and that sense of being able to be transported back to that very positive time in almost because of a physical stimulation, I think is a really interesting, really powerful idea that she can't help herself. It's just there. So Rumens tells us that for her, the main thought in the 3rd stanza is that you can recover your inner life through writing. And so all of this poem for her is about the power of creative writing and being able to give yourself the space to explore in a way that has been lost to so many people as they have grown up. So we've already talked about this line a little. I have no passport, there's no way back at all. So that sense of again, if we're reading it as the inner Emigree, in that sense of there is no way back at all, because it is time that has created this division, nothing else. However, if we're looking at it in a more political way, the impact of having no passport is really important, because your passport is your proof of who you are, it's your identity. It's what says I belong here. It's got your country stamped on the front and goes, this is where they belong. So if you have no passport, there's that sense of being adrift and not belonging anywhere. You also get this sense of urgency and the panic of fleeing without any documentation and the fear that must create. But my city comes to me in its own white plane. Again, I quite like this idea that she says, I had an image of the flying paper darts I used to make as a child when I wrote that line. It's almost like she can't get back there, but perhaps the place itself can come to her, and it's now sort of becoming personified and becoming alive. It's seeking her out. So while she may have moved on or tried to move on as she's grown up, the memories of the place itself come to her, and almost as if they're alive. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. So you've got this very caring imagery which looks after it, almost like a pet. My city takes me dancing through the city of walls. So she feels like where she lives now is walled in and enclosed and oppressive. But her city, the memory of her city gives her freedom and joy in a way that she couldn't have before. They accuse me of absence, they circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. So again, if we go back to our political reading as, someone who's like a refugee, you've got this very bullying image of someone being in the middle of a circle of people who are accusing her of things. And this sense of guilt or judgment, there's a sense of, they accuse me of absence. So the things she remembers in her city are angry at her for leaving, but then the people who are in her new place don't want her there either. So there's that sense of constantly feeling disconnected and not belonging, and almost shameful of how she feels and who she is, because she doesn't really fit anywhere. Okay, and I think that interpretation works in both of the main sort of ways we can read this poem. They accuse me of being dark in their free city. So you've got this hostility of her new safe space, that ambivalence. And notice how the they shifts between those two lines to show that internal conflict. No one is happy with her. And my city hides behind me. So it needs protecting. She has to look after it now. They mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. So shadows we often talk about as dark or dangerous. They're an absence of life. But the shadow is also proof she exists. It's her outline. It's that image of her. And it's evidence of the joy and the happiness of the sunlight. You don't get shadows on a dark day. So there is a sun shining. There is hope. There is optimism. And that's the word we end on. We end on sunlight. We end on that optimism. Because it is that positive word to end on, that sense of there is hope, there is joy out there that has to be found. So there's this sense that she almost has to defend, if we go back to our inner Emigree, she has to defend this innocent, joyous place from those who want her to leave it behind her and grow up and be sensible and boring. And she can't do it. She has to defend it. So she's protecting it and wants to get back to that joyous sunlight which she's been seeking throughout the poem. So for some thoughts on this poem, firstly, I'm sort of, who is this poem for? Is it to give voice to the refugees who feel lost and unwanted? Is it to challenge those of us who could have more empathy? Is it to hopefully make all of us realise that on some level we are all lost and have had to lose things that mean a lot to us? There's also this idea that escaping from one conflict doesn't mean that the experience is over or automatically results in a happy ending. So even if it's a physical conflict or an inner conflict, just because there's been a sort of some level of resolution doesn't mean that everything's okay. So you might grow up into a perfectly happy, successful adult, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a part of you that will be sad and yearn for the simpler, more joyous times of childhood. It doesn't mean that getting out of a dangerous place means that you're automatically going to be happy and delighted with where you are now. And there's also this sense of it reflects the long-term damage of conflict. So the experience lasts a lifetime. So any sort of struggle or damage, whether it be a physical conflict, a real conflict, or an imagined conflict, it will change you, because all we are is a sum of our memories. So if we have experienced that, it does have that long-lasting impact. So just before we finish, I want to finish off with another couple of extracts from what Rumens has said herself, so that you can be really clear on this. So she talks about putting it in this anthology. It's a reminder that ordinary people are often in conflict with the rules of their societies. They may live in a privileged, free societies, but there can still be political or social obligations which restrict their creativity, especially if they're women. They may have rich inner lives which are never reflected in their daily reality. Young writers, in addition, often struggle with literary convention. They want to do things differently. They feel their voices aren't heard. So for Rumens, she's trying to stand up for the marginalised people who perhaps our society isn't built for. You know, it wasn't necessarily designed for women. It wasn't designed for young people. And their frustrations at having to conform to a society that wasn't built for them, that wasn't designed for them, but that they still have to conform to. So you've got a really nice way into her purpose and the bigger picture she's trying to convey there. To sum up, the Emigree is not a realist narrative. The Lost Country is an imagined country which has become the poet's inner homeland. I love that phrase, the inner homeland. That's where she feels she belongs, is in this place of her imagination. It's not a geographical entity, although to make the metaphor work, there are some realist touches. So that sense that there is this realist aspect to this of a political reading at the same time. My speaker has resisted the demand to leave her place of her imagination. As an inner emigree, she brings her vision with her, and its inner dreamlike reality lights her harsher, narrower world. So a lovely idea that she draws strength and power from this place which everyone wants her to leave behind, but she's resisting that call. So again, that conflict and this power struggle over the way she ought to behave. Power is challenged, even if only through writing. Okay. To be in an inner emigree is to be human. I was pleased and surprised by the defiant tone which entered the last stanza. The rebel finds joyous freedom despite her everyday life in a city of walls. So that sense of, for her, this poem ends on this joyous freedom, even though she's stuck in this city of walls, this enclosed space, as we said, because it ends on this evidence of sunlight. There is that sense of freedom and happiness which comes through. Now, I would say that this poem is arguably now one of the more complex ones in this anthology when we're now looking at this in terms of these different interpretations. So just be aware of this and of the importance of showing that you understand that there are different ways to read this and what the poet herself has said she was trying to say. I would strongly recommend that you see your English teacher about a full copy of the article, which you can then go through and highlight to your heart's content, and to think about ways in which you can write about these two different interpretations at the same time, because that will really help you, but you have to be aware of the different layers. So think about those phrases like, at first glance, it appears, however, so that you can show you're aware of the depth of meaning that there is in this poem.